Shalom friends, and welcome back to A Small Sanctuary and to the second episode of my Tallit series. Really glad to have you all here. I've been harvesting some questions from social media and I'm very excited for our third episode in which I will be dealing with some of those really specific and interesting and fun and encouraging questions. So do stay tuned for that. But today we're really going to do a deep dive into those sources. As you can see, I am wearing a tallit. This is a golden oldie as far as I'm concerned. It is quite old. I've had it for a long time now, about 17 years. And it is the B'nai Or the Penei Or, depending how you want to translate it. B'nai Or, sons or children of light, or Penei Or, faces of light. Tallit that was designed by Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, and that's become kind of an industry standard. What I like about this tallit is that it is both traditional but also very bright and colorful. It's got rainbow stripes and it is also quite affordable. So this is a great tallit to get and it is very popular. This is also the tallit that I tend to wear for pride marches and Pride Shabbat for obvious reasons because it has the rainbow stripes. So it doubles in that sense as well. So I just wanted to show you this, one of my collection. I have a few different talitot and let's get stuck in with today's session. Okay, the tallit is off. It was getting a little warm and we're going to get stuck in. So what are we going to do today? This is going to be an intensive text-based session. So if you are unfamiliar with the study of Jewish texts, I invite you to treat yourself with kindness and patience if you struggle with some of the concepts. And if you are an experienced student of Jewish text, then welcome aboard. I will not be citing the original Hebrew or Aramaic sources. I don't think that's quite necessary, but for sure, if that's your jam, you can find those in Safaria. I will, of course, reference the texts themselves and talk about them. I'm going to be drawing on some rabbinic texts throughout the rabbinic era from about 200 CE of the Common Era to today. We've already talked about the biblical foundations of the Tallit in my previous video, and you can find those biblical foundations in that video as well. The biblical foundations are from the book of Numbers, chapter 15, verses 37 to 41, and from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 22, verse 12. So I invite you to look into those. The framework I want to use for this session is, what does it mean to be a Jew who is obligated in the commandments? And what does that mean for a gendered or an ungendered or all-gendered approach to Judaism? Here are a few caveats. First of all, not all Jewish denominations believe in obligation. I need to throw out my cat because my cat was playing with my tallit. Go figure. Reform Judaism, for instance, comes from a theological perspective of informed choice. The idea that the student of Judaism will study what the tradition and the sources have to say, but leaves the ultimate decision-making authority with the individual, rather with the Halakhic, the Jewish legal authorities of the rabbinic community or the community at large. That's an important distinction. And so for a lot of Reform Jews, speaking in terms of obligation might not be all that relevant or meaningful. But Reform Judaism does value sacred practice, of course, and values the customs of our people. So that is not to say that Reform Judaism has nothing to say about this. On the contrary, Reform Judaism has a lot to say about this, especially from a perspective of inclusion and equality. And that is a very important ethical driver in the conversation. For conservative Judaism and Orthodox Judaism, the language of Halakhic Jewish legal obligation may be far more relevant. That doesn't mean that every Orthodox or conservative Jew adheres to the halakha. They may still make decisions about what to choose to observe and what not to observe. But it does mean that the overarching philosophical framework for conservative and Orthodox Judaism is that halakha is binding and that we listen to rabbinic authorities and the interpretive reading of these authorities to arrive at conclusions on ritual practice. Now, obviously, there are distinctions between conservative and Orthodox Judaism, namely the place of science, the place of biblical critical scholarship, the place of modern notions of equality and inclusion, and the place of women in general in ritual life. The conservative movement has been ordaining women as rabbis for decades and counts women in the minyan. So that is a distinction between those movements in Judaism. A last word about Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Judaism as a big tent is actually much more internally diverse than non-Orthodox Judaism. If you think about Reform, Reconstructionist, conservative, and in a certain way renewal as being within the fold of liberal or non-Orthodox Judaism, and you think that's a big tent, well, the tent of orthodoxy is even bigger, ranging from modern orthodoxy to very deeply devout and quite insular Hasidic communities and everything in between. I will not pretend to speak for Orthodox Judaism. I am not an Orthodox Jew, but I want us to be cognizant that the internal world of the Orthodox community is very wide-ranging, including their positions on gender inclusion and the mitzvot. We will yank this right back and talk about the non-Orthodox perspective, and that will be our operating frame. I will try my best to speak to all the non-Orthodox denominations and do them all justice and pay them all respect. If I were to title this video anything, I would title it Equal Citizens of the Halakhic Nation, because fundamentally at the root of the question of women or all genders and the wearing of tzitzit lies a question of equality of participation, equality of representation, and equality of obligation. And as an aside, a lot of these teachings apply to tefillin as well. There might be a tefillin video in the future, but just so you know, in any tefillin video I might very well refer back to this one. These questions apply to a central category called mitzvot aseh shehazman grama, commandments that one does that are affected or caused by time, which is a very weird sentence, but in more common parlance we might say the time-bound commandments. And we will touch on that later because it's a really important category to understand, and it is a difficult one to understand. In order for us to start, I would like us to look at a few underlying questions that we will try to answer in this video. Here are some issues to consider. Why are women exempt from time-bound commandments? Does this exemption make sense within the halakhic system? Are tefillin and tallit male garments? What is the reward for doing extra mitzvot? Is it virtuous or arrogant to do so? What is the influence of modernity? And is the category of women that was used in the times of the Mishnah the same as women as we experience womanhood today? I also want to say that I'm consciously using the language of both women and all genders simultaneously because I want to lift up both disenfranchised populations within the community. I want to lift up women as we have traditionally been shut out from certain practices in Judaism, and I also want to uplift people who may not identify with the gender binary at all. Of course, it goes without saying that anyone who is transmasculine or transfeminine belongs under the rubric of all genders, and this is an LGBTQ affirming space. At the end, I actually don't think bifurcating or splicing these questions into different issues of gender, however we choose to see or construct gender, is actually all that helpful. But given that this is an important category for us to think about, I did want to briefly touch on how we can see that from a Jewish perspective. Again, that is a very complicated issue, way above the pay grade of this video for all intents and purposes, in the egalitarian denominations of Judaism, we do not have any gender distinctions, no matter how people experience or express their gender, and they are free and empowered to do so. Now let's get back to the sources. The first two sources are the biblical sources that I referred in my other video. Numbers 15, 37 to 41 and Deuteronomy 22:12. I'm not going to revisit those texts because I've already talked about them, but I do want to say this. Both texts are arguably gender neutral. Yes, the Numbers texts talks about Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Israel, or the children of Israel. And Bnei Yisrael in our tradition is an ambiguous term that can refer both to a binary category of all men, presumably cisgender, in antiquity, or it can actually refer to the entire population of the Jewish people. Can you read Bnei Yisrael as being very narrow, pertaining only to men in the sources pertaining to tzitzit? You could, but I actually don't really think it is a very authentic reading, because there are so many covenantal distinctions, and Bnei Yisrael is a covenantal term of inclusion to basically say all Jews, that I actually don't think it's useful to go down that path in most cases. For the purposes of this video, I am reading Bnei Yisrael, say until the children of Israel, as being gender inclusive. Now we're going to get a little bit technical, and we're going to talk about positive time-bound commandments as a category and as they are used to determine issues of inclusion according to gender in Judaism. Some commandments have to be performed during a certain limited time frame. And the time frame that is usually described as being time-bound are daylight hours. You can do a certain mitzvah, a certain commandment, from the time the sun comes up to when the sun comes down. Of course, there are other mitzvot that you actually do when the sun is already down, right until the sun comes up, like the evening Shema and the counting of the Omer. But for the purposes of our discussion here, time-bound commandments are a narrow category of mitzvot that are determined during daylight hours. That is not to say that other commandments don't have a time frame. This is a legal construct, not necessarily a descriptor of how mitzvot work. So for instance, lighting Shabbat candles is definitely a time-sensitive commandment. You do it 18 minutes before sunset, or whatever your practice dictates at the start of the Sabbath. But it is not classed as a time-bound commandment. And this will become relevant as well, because actually the time-bound commandments as a category are pretty artificial. And when we think of this in an analytical way, being able to determine that this feels a little bit construed may actually allow us to shift the category. Not in order to get rid of time-bound commandments, but for us to be able to say, well, you know what? This doesn't quite add up. There are some logical inconsistencies in this system. Okay, that is all very technical. So, for our purposes, a time-bound commandment is a commandment that needs to be kept during daylight hours. You have negative time-bound commandments and you have positive time-bound commandments. Negative commandments are the you shall not do. The positive commandments are the you shall do. You also have non-time-bound commandments. Commandments that aren't very time specific, we just do them whenever. So for instance, keeping kosher. We don't only keep kosher on Shabbat, we keep kosher all year round. That is a non-time-bound commandment. So as you can see, if you would draw this out in a matrix, you would have a grid with 4 boxes. Stay with me. 1. Positive time-bound commandments. 2. Negative time-bound commandments. 3. Positive non-time-bound commandments. 4. Negative non-time-bound commandments. And you can sort all of the commandments of the Jewish tradition into each of these categories. And that would cover and organize all of the commandments. So let's list an example of each of these just to show how the system works. So a negative non-time-bound commandment would be, you shall not murder. That is pretty self-evident. A negative time-bound commandment might be, you shall not eat chametz, leavened products, during Pesach. The prohibition only lasts for a certain time and then it lapses. A positive non-time-bound commandment may be the study of Torah or the giving of tzedakah, of righteous giving, redistributive giving, or charity, however you choose to translate it. There are not really any set times when you do this, you just do it, and you have to be motivated to do it. And then the last one, which was our first one, remember, is positive time-bound commandments, the commandments that need to be done during daylight hours. And as a category, the Mishnah tells us that women are exempt from these time-bound commandments. The Mishnah isn't really clear on this either. First of all, it's not always clear on what actually is classed as a positive time-bound commandment, and it isn't always clear on why or when women are exempt. So some very famous or well-known time-bound positive commandments are tzitzit, tefillin, lulav, the species that you shake during Sukkot, shofar, the ram's horn that you blow on Rosh Hashanah. What do all of these things have in common? That is kind of the underlying question that I think we should grapple with. What all of these things have in common is that they are visible and public displays of Jewish status and participation in the community, legislated in a time where there was ambivalence or even outright hostility about women being public actors in ritual or civic spheres. And that is a really important thing to remember. They are also distinctive in that they are exclusive to people of lower status. So for instance, not only are women exempt for time-bound commandments, but so are slaves and minors and Gentiles. Well, Gentiles, of course, aren't bound to any of the commandments, but a Gentile can become a Jew. And so this is an important principle to keep in mind. Given that women, minors, slaves, and Gentiles are exempt from these commandments, we are seeing a social hierarchy. But in terms of the other three categories, that social hierarchy is resolvable. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Minors grow up. As soon as they hit the age of maturity at 12 or 13, they become obligated. Slaves, meaning Hebrew slaves, Jewish slaves, according to Mishnaic and Talmudic law, or even biblical law, are emancipated in their 7th year. Then they regain equal social standing and become obligated in all of the mitzvot. As for Gentiles, well, obviously, the large majority of Gentiles have no interest in observing the mitzvot because they're Gentiles and they happily practice their own faith, their own covenant, their own traditions, and Judaism respects that. For Gentiles who feel moved to become Jews and convert to Judaism, well, obviously, as soon as they convert, they also become commanded in the mitzvot. So, as you can see, these three categories resolve themselves. The only one that remains in perpetuity is the category of womanhood. Women, according to our traditional sources, will always be not obligated in the time-bound commandments. And you might think, why is it so important to be obligated anyway? What's the big deal? So you are, free from having to do stuff. That sounds pretty nice, right? Like, I don't have to pray 3 times a day. I don't have to bother wearing a tallit. I don't have to do this or that. Well, it's very important to remember that in the classical Judaic worldview, obligation is from which we derive rights, representation, and participation. To not be obligated in the Jewish worldview means to not have equal access and not have equal representation. Classical Judaism works through a framework of a universe of obligation, as opposed to our Western, American, European, liberal democratic thinking, which thinks in a universe of rights. In Judaism, we kind of reverse, we flip the order. We say we believe people are obligated, and from their obligations, they derive certain rights. So if you are an egalitarian, at whatever level, a gender egalitarian, or a social egalitarian within the framework of Judaism, it's actually really important to create equal obligation for everyone if you want to enfranchise people or Jewish people within the context of the covenant. Now, this is why I call this teaching equal citizens of the Halakhic nation, because at its very root, this is a conversation not about whether a tallit is masculine or not. It's not a discussion about whether people are used to something or whether it's weird or uncomfortable. None of that stuff really matters from a classical worldview. What matters is the question of obligation. The sociological or the social things I just described matter in different ways, but not in this way. So, having explained these first principles, let's take a look at one of our first texts, which comes from the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, Talmud Bavli, Kiddushin 34a. This language will be very technical. Don't worry, I'm going to talk you through it. As the sages taught in the Baraita, what are positive time-bound commandments? Sukkah and lulav, shofar and tzitzit and tefillin. And what are positive non-time-bound commandments? Mezuzah, constructing a roof railing, returning lost property, and sending away the mother bird from her nest. Is this a general principle? Behold, matzah on Passover, rejoicing on festivals, and assembly on every seventh Sukkot. These are positive time-bound commandments in which women are obligated. Also, behold, the study of Torah, procreation, and the redemption of the firstborn. These are not time-bound positive commandments, yet women are exempt. Said Rabbi Yochanan, we cannot learn from general principles, even in the place of a stated exception. So what's going on here? Basically, the Talmud is making an inventory of these different mitzvah categories that I referred to earlier in my little matrix, right? And the Gemara, the Talmud itself, is confused. What is a time-bound commandment? When are women obligated? When are women exempt? This text goes into some technical details about which kinds of commandments. As I said, that first list are commandments that are representational, public, and that say something about the participation and dignity of the person who performs them. And women are exempt. There are other commandments that we would call civic commandments, ethical commandments, protecting people from falling off from your roof by imposing a railing, for example, or chasing away the mother bird before you take her eggs, which is seen as an ethical fulfillment of care to not cause distress to the mother bird. That is another category of commandments. And then there are some commandments that are legitimately phenotypically or sex bound, as in they involve secondary sexual characteristics belonging to cisgender men. Being assigned male at birth, redeeming your firstborn son, maybe growing a beard upon hitting puberty. There are a number of commandments associated with those as well. So the Talmud is already struggling with the fact that this system doesn't really make any sense.